Okay, good morning. Again, I'm Katie Williams with the Division of Data Accountability and Research, and today this webinar is being held to help prepare LEAs for the Access for ELLs administration, specifically as it relates to the roster verification and test materials ordering. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the question box and I will address them periodically throughout the webinar. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be published on the OSSI website on the Access for ELLs 2.0 page. The goals of this webinar are to help LEAs successfully prepare to successfully complete the Access for ELLs roster verification, order the testing materials, and complete all required training activities prior to test administration. So we're going to first do a quick overview and reminder of the Access for ELLs 2.0 timeline and what's new about this assessment and who should be taking this assessment. Then we are going to review the roster preparation process, which has changed slightly this year as we've moved to a new testing vendor. And then we are going to talk about the training requirements, as I just mentioned. And finally, we'll review some resources available on the WIDA website to help schools prepare. So jumping into an overview of the Access for ELLs 2.0 assessment, the Access for ELLs 2.0 is offered online for students in grades 1 through 12. Listening and speaking tests will be delivered through a media enhanced device, and the assessment is still on paper for students in grades kindergarten and those taking the alternate Access for ELLs assessment. The speaking assessment includes an all-new voice recording design that can be administered in a group setting. Online speaking is now centrally scored by DRC, Data Recognition Corp., which is the new testing vendor. It used to be Metratech. And in the past, these speaking tests used to be scored by the test administrators themselves. And then finally, the online assessment has additional accessibility features, which were never available previously. So looking at each test domain and the actions required for each test domain, these charts show the differences between the online and the paper version. So you can see in listening and reading, all of the passages and the response choices are captured and displayed on the computer screen, whereas previously, the paper form and the test booklets were used for these domains. The big changes are in speaking and writing. For speaking, the prompts are played on the computer screen by the student, as opposed to with the CD by the test administrator. And the speaking answers are recorded into headsets and scored remotely. In the writing, for students in grades 1 through 3, they're going to read the prompts on a paper test form, and they're actually going to write their responses in a paper test form. For students in grades 4 through 12 on the online, they're going to read the prompts on a computer screen and capture their responses in the computer using the keyboard. This chart lays out the overall timeline for the Access for ELLs administration. The roster verification begins today and runs through February 22nd, so you have a month to complete the roster verification. Excuse me, having technical difficulties. After that happens, on February 29th, the window opens to begin to order testing materials and pre-ID labels, and that window closes on March 18th. Then from March 18th until the test window begins and until you receive your testing materials in April, you should be setting up the software and preparing so that you can administer the online assessment without a hitch. Then the testing window this year runs from April 25th through June 3rd. And then I'll give you just 1 minute to read the rest of the dates there. All right. Any questions so far? I see one question. I haven't gotten access to the QuickBase tool for the roster verification. I will take your name down and check on that after the meeting, after the webinar. Everyone should now be loaded into the QuickBase system, and it may be that invitations haven't been sent out, so I'll just double check on that and resend the invitation if it hasn't come out. Question, do LEAs have a choice of whether to use the online or paper, or is it required to take the online? It's required to take the online unless there's some extenuating circumstance that would not allow your LEA to use the online. But again, the online is for students in grades 1 through 12, and as you saw, students in grades 1 through 3 take the writing and a paper test booklet. So who takes the access for ELLs 2.0? Students in the following groups must take the access for ELLs until they exit ELL status by scoring a 5.0 or above composite proficiency level on the access for ELLs. All students in grades K through 12 who have been identified as an English learner by your LEA according to an Aussie-approved EL screener. Also, all students in first grade who took the kindergarten WIDA Access Placement Test, the KWAPT, in kindergarten and scored FES, or Fluent English Speaking Proficiency Level. Those students should also take the access this year. And then finally, ELs who opted out of receiving services. Those students are still required to take the annual Access for ELLs assessment. So now I'm going to jump into the roster verification process. This process is very similar to past years. The very first 3 steps are the same, or 4 steps even, and the last step is what is going to change, your submission process. So the first step is to download your roster from QuickBase. Step 2, complete, update, and verify all the information. Step 3, you return the completed roster via QuickBase. Step 4, Aussie reviews the roster, reformats the roster, and returns it to your LEA via QuickBase. And then the final step is to take that final roster and submit it through the WETA AMS to order your test materials. So we're going to look at this step by step. The first step is to download your roster from QuickBase. So how to do that, you navigate to QuickBase, which is octo.quickbase.com, and you log in using your user-created credentials. If you aren't a user yet, you can create a login by selecting the circled area in the screenshot below. And then if you forgot your password, you can actually reset it by saying, I forgot my password. Aussie does not maintain these passwords. So, and then once you are logged in, you click on the Access for ELLs Roster Prep application. And then once you're within that, you will see under your roster, you'll see this preliminary roster download. And you can click on that. It's an Excel document to download it. Save it locally, and then make your edits and complete your verification. So I'm going to show you actually at this time how to do that. So I've navigated to octo.quickbase.com. And I'm logging in. I click on the Access for ELLs roster prep application, read the instructions here, and under the Access Roster Upload, here is my roster. So when I click on that, it's going to allow me to download and save it. And I've already pre-downloaded the roster, and this is what it looks like. It has 3 tabs: Instructions, your roster, and then the language codes. Any questions about how to access your rosters? Question, will this webinar be emailed to LEAs to review? The webinar will be published online, so you can download it from the website, the Access for ELLs page on the website. Okay, going back to the presentation. Now we're at step 2, which is completing, updating, and verifying all the information in the roster. Most of the data elements in the roster have been pre-populated by OSSI based on information in SLED. There are some data elements that I want to highlight that need to be completed if the information is missing. So the first one is the native language. This is a required field, and this is a 3-letter code representing the student's native language. So SPA is Spanish, AMH, Amharic, VIE, Vietnamese, and so on. There's a tab in the roster, which I just showed you, that actually lists out pretty much every language you could imagine. The next field, and this is optional, is the date of the student's first enrollment in the U.S. school, not at your school, but in a U.S. school. The next field is the number of years rounded down the student has been enrolled in an EL program. For kindergartners, it would be 0. Next, a migratory student. So if a student is a migrant, according to the Title I, Part 3 definition, you would enter M, otherwise N. Next, 504 plan. If the student has been identified as a student with disabilities, as defined by the Rehabilitation Act and American with Disabilities Act, you would enter a Y, otherwise N. Next, there are a number of bilingual or ESL program types. This is the same as in past years. This basically describes the type of service the student receives. So no services, no additional services means no additional services are provided to the student. Content area tutoring, content-based ELL, ESL, developmental bilingual, and so on. And you need to mark Y for at least one of these options, even if it's just no additional services for each student on the roster. And then the state delivery model, which describes how students receive these bilingual or ESL services. Again, at least one must be identified, even if it's not applicable, or parental refusal of services. The next, there are a group of test accommodations, which need to be marked as yes in accordance with a student's IEP or 504 plan. So only students who are marked as special education students or students with 504 plans are those students who would be eligible for special accommodations on the Access for ELLs assessment. And then there are a few new data fields in the roster this year. The first one is the student testing online or paper. So this describes the format in which the access for ELLs 2.0 will be administered. For students in grades 1 through 12, this will default to online. For students in kindergarten and who are taking the alternate assessment, it will default to paper. The next is an alternate access tester. We've pre-populated this information, so it's an indication that an EL student is eligible and will take the alternate access assessment. It will be yes for those students who will take the alternate access and no for those who are not eligible or who have not been identified as eligible preliminarily by OSSE. And then finally, an identification of the student's tier. This only needs to be completed for paper test takers. This is the same as in past years. There are tiers A, B, and C, a dash for kindergartners and blank otherwise. And there's guidance on the WIDA website that shows how to identify what tier a student is. And actually, I might pause and just show you that quickly because I pulled it up. Once you go to the WIDA website, if you go to the download library, there is a tier placement protocol and a tier placement tutorial. The tier placement protocol is this PDF document, which I'm displaying right now. It gives some good guidance, and then for your even more detailed guidance, you can follow the tier placement tutorial. I'm going to pause again for questions. Feel free to enter any questions you have. All right, we'll keep going then. The last two data fields in the far right of the roster are two that are just there as checks. So it's a check that says previously proficient, and this means that a student is currently being identified as an English learner by your LEA, but the student has actually scored proficient in the past on the access for ELLs assessment. So this is just a flag for your LEA to check and see if that student is actually supposed to be tested. Have they been exited and should not actually be identified as an ELL, or have they been returned to EL status by your LEA? That's something that you have to make. That decision is something you have to make at the LEA level. And then the last one is a native language check, which is basically flagging instances where a student's native language is marked as English. This is just a double check for you to go back and double check. Now, if there are changes to this preliminary roster, if there are students missing or students that needed to be added or information on the roster that is inaccurate and needs to be changed, this is how you make those changes. In the roster, there's a data field called Change Required. You can select Remove if there's a student on your roster you would like OSSE to remove. Just specify that the student should be removed, and in the comments column, which is right next to the Change Required column, specify why. This student exited, this student is not actually eligible, it was a data error. Then, if you want to add students to the roster, at the very bottom of your preliminary roster, you would create a new row for the student you want to add, complete all the necessary data fields, and then select Add in the Change Required column. This is exactly the same as how it has been done in the past 2 years, so this shouldn't be new. And then if you need to amend any data, make sure, first of all, that the information is accurate in your student information system, your PowerSchool, to ensure that the data are accurate from this point forward in OSSE's data systems. Then select Change Required, and in the comments column, explain the change that needs to be made. So for example, Danielle Johnson's birthday should be 10/9/1996. Any questions about this, how to make changes to the preliminary roster? Okay, So before we jump into the next step, I'm actually going to look at my roster, my test roster, and review these data fields. So I have 10 students, or 9 students rather, who have been identified by OSSI as needing to take the access. So I would review all of the information populated. And then I see here the native language is blank for 2 of my students. So I'm going to have to fill in their native languages. And I'm going to do that by looking at the language codes. So I know that Carlos Hernandez is a Spanish speaker. So I'm going to enter SPA here. And then let's say, for instance, that Jorge Borges is, he speaks Portuguese. So I would go over to the language codes and look up Portuguese. That's POR is the code. So then I would enter POR. Okay, continuing over, the length of time in an EL program and the date first enrolled in a U.S. school. You'd fill that in if you can. Are my students migrants? None of my students are migrants. Do any of them have 504 plans? No. And then the next group are the type of the program type. So you're going to select one of those or more for every student. Then the state delivery model. Select one state delivery model for every student. And then the special accommodations. Those are selected only for students with disabilities. Now, if you make any changes to any of the pre-populated data, here is where you would say change, add, or remove. So if I actually need to remove a student, I would just write remove and then say the student withdrew and leave that blank for the rest. So all these students are taking the online test. Some more special accommodations. The one thing I did want to show you that I didn't speak to previously is that for each student, we've provided their access for ELL's testing history, just for your LEA's record keeping and convenience. So you can see from the 2007-8 school year all the way through the 14-15 school year, students' composite proficiency levels on the assessment. So this student right here is actually being flagged as a previously proficient student because they are being identified as ELL now, but took the test in 2012-13 and scored proficient. So this is a student who I would need to go back to my records at the LEA level and say, should this student be identified as an English learner? Have they been monitored and then decided to be returned back to ELL status, and so they should test this spring, or should they actually be removed from my ELL list and from this testing roster? And then this is check native language, which would mean that the language was identified as English. Any questions? All right. Moving along. Then after you're done making all of the changes to the roster, you would upload the roster to QuickBase. So again, you log back into QuickBase, the exact same application, and then there's a data field called Roster Complete Upload, and you browse and select your completed roster and upload there. This needs to be completed on or before February 22nd, 2016. After that point, because DRC requires these rosters to be submitted in a very specific format, OSSI is going to take the roster you submit and reformat it so it meets the requirements of DRC, and then send the final roster back to you in a submission-ready format. So you can order your pre-ID labels using the final roster. So when we send it back to you, we are going to upload it to the section right here. It says roster. Oh, excuse me, hold on. Let me show you on the application. Final roster for submission to DRC is what it says. This is where you'll go to download your final roster. Okay. The next step after you have your final roster, which should come, within a week after you have submitted your final roster, then you are in the last step of this process, which is ordering your test materials from WIDA using the WIDA AMS. So in order to order your pre-ID labels, you navigate to the WIDA AMS, which is www.wida/ams.us. You log in using your credentials. No one has been loaded to the AMS system yet, so you should not be able to log in yet, but over the next month, we're going to be adding you to the system and sending you your credentials. Once you're added, you can go to the test setup on the left-hand navigation bar and go to Manage Students. From the Manage Students page, you would select Upload Multiple Students, read the instructions, and then click Upload once you attach your document. I'm going to show you this short 3-minute tutorial video that actually takes you through those steps. This is produced by WIDA. All right, thank you for taking the time to watch that video tutorial with me. I thought it was very informative, and it's available on the WIDA website. So you can download it. The link is at the top of this webinar at any time. Any questions about the submission of the pre-ID labels? Okay. Similarly, to submit your paper materials ordering, you also do that through the WIDA AMS system. You log in using your credentials, and under the Materials section in the left-hand navigation bar, select Materials Ordering, read the instructions, and complete the requested information, and then click Complete. Again, there is another tutorial that shows step-by-step how to complete this process. And I'm not going to show this video, but it's very similar to the one we just saw, and I would recommend, if you have to order paper materials, to actually walk through and listen to this tutorial. It's very instructive. So that is all for the roster completion and test materials ordering process. Test materials have to be ordered by March 18th is the deadline for that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about test administrator preparation. So all Access for ELLs 2.0 test administrators must take the online training course, which is accessible at weda.us/online training. It's easily accessible from the WIDA website. You need to watch all applicable modules about the WIDA AMS, the Access for ELLs 2.0 online administration portal, complete all tasks as soon as possible, but no later than the beginning of your district's testing window. Then depending on your role, there are also some other requirements. For each role, the test coordinator, the test administrator, and the technology coordinator, there are checklists online. We would like you to check to review the checklists and make sure that you are hitting all of the bullets on those checklists, and keep the checklist in your binder, your test administration binder. Then the web-based training for the test coordinator and for the test administrator. And then if you are administering the kindergarten assessment, there's the online training course. And that's all for the test requirements. WETA Resources. This last section is just to highlight and review some of the resources available on the WETA website for you. So the first, under the Access for ELLs 2.0 page, there are a number of resources. Interactive checklists, like I was just saying, the training modules, technology requirements, the facilitator toolkit, a frequently asked questions document, a link to the WIDA AMS, and the training modules. Whoops, listed that one twice, sorry. Then there are additional resources on the WIDA AMS system. The WIDA AMS system contains the test software, a test demo, and sample items. Access will be granted to test coordinators, test administrators, and technology coordinators. At the state level, we add all of the district test coordinators, which are the ELL coordinator contacts that OSSI maintains. Then it's the district coordinator's job to add any of the school level test administrators. The WIDA AMS is a one-stop shop for all tools and information needed for the Access for ELLs 2.0 administration. The technology coordinator contact information will be provided by DRC to DRC by OSSI, and once we have that information from you, you'll receive an email granting you access to the WIDA AMS. You'll need to download the testing software from the WIDA AMS under Test Setup and then Technology Downloads. There are two pieces that you need to download. The first is the Testing Site Manager, the TSM, and the second is Insight, one student per workstation. And then finally, because students may be unfamiliar with responding and recording to their speech into a microphone, once you have the software installed, it's highly recommended that you let students practice with the software through the interactive practice test. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Aussie, but for technical questions, I recommend reaching out to DRC's customer support, and the number and email address are listed at the bottom of the slide here. And that is all. If you have any questions regarding the roster verification, please email Susanna Horton. All other questions will be directed to Lanisha Adams. Lanisha Adams is Aussie's new Special Populations Assessment Specialist and will be taking over the lead role on all things WIDA and EL assessment. And then if you haven't already, I'm going to put the link in the chat box here for the Technology Coordinator collection. If you could please fill out this form providing Aussie your technology coordinator's information. Are there any other questions? I've come to the end of my webinar, and I'm happy to pause for any questions you have, and I'm happy to stay on the line. If you don't have any, you're welcome to go. Thank you very much for your time. So question, our spring break begins on April 11th. Is there an alternate date for receiving test materials? No, there's not. There's not an alternate date, but if we could talk about that offline, we might be able to work with DRC to have the test materials delivered a day early. You can email me at katie.williams@dc.gov. I can just write that in here. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stay online, but thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Stay safe with the upcoming snowstorm.